Hi, I'm Daniel Zwerdling.
I'm David Shipler. Two reporters start now. Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks, Dave. And here's our mission today. Our guests are going to tell us about one of the most shocking scandals in the United States, to me anyway. And I bet you listeners know little or nothing about it. I sure didn't until I started preparing for our chat.
And here it is. Americans have a far higher death rate than people in other wealthy countries, especially in Europe. Far more young people die and more middle-aged people die. And by the way, most of them are white. One of our guests is the lead author on the study that revealed this a couple of years ago, and he puts it this way. If Americans had the same mortality rate as the average European country, more than 600,000 Americans who died in a recent year would still be alive. And in some years, more than 1 million Americans who died would still be living.
And our guests say, don't blame this mainly on individual Americans for not taking good care of themselves, although, of course, many do not. They drink too much, they don't exercise enough, they eat too many processed foods, etc. But recent studies show that Americans die at higher rates than other people, mainly because of political and economic and social policies. Please welcome our first guest, Katherine Newman. She's a world-famous researcher, and she's one of the top vice presidents at the University of California. Katherine Newman, thanks so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
So when I said that Americans die at higher rates mainly because of political and social and economic policies, meaning what to you?
Well, we have a very different welfare state structure, a very different way of allocating the resources that we spend on our people than other countries do. I have a son who lives in Denmark. Childcare is universally available, extremely inexpensive. Public transportation, extremely accessible and very, very affordable. Schooling, very evenly provided across income groups. Almost all of these provisions look worse in the United States, and this has a very profound effect on our people. It's especially powerful for children. The U.S. mortality rate for children is much, much higher than advanced nations around the world. U.S. kids are 15 times more likely to die from firearms. American kids are more than twice as likely to die in motor vehicle crashes. Homicide and substance use, these are all violence-related epidemics, if you will. And infants twice as likely to die due to factors like prematurity and SIDS.
And SIDS, of course, is sudden infant death syndrome, which is still kind of a mystery, right? Although researchers say that mothers who smoke or who didn't get much prenatal care have a higher risk.
And those are related to poor health and nutrition, right?
Those are related to prenatal problems. Those are related to the general conditions in low-income households, in very low-income households, the availability of care for mothers. All of those things contribute to this.
And again, America has a much higher rate of these kinds of problems than most of Europe does.
And those disparities have been widening dramatically since the 1980s. So there are huge differences in what we invest in who we protect, and how we allocate our, especially healthcare dollars, that have dramatic effects on our population. And our European counterparts have been much more generous and much more attentive to these differences than the United States.
I want to mention, Katherine, that you've written almost a dozen books over the past few decades examining these gaps. The first one I read was No Shame in My Game, about fast food workers in New York City, which I think came out, about 25 years ago?
A long time ago, David.
And now, please welcome Jacob Bor from Boston University. He's the epidemiologist who studies on mortality rates, along with his colleagues, kind of shook up the health world a couple of years ago. Jacob, you and your colleagues came up with a chilling name for the people who die too young in the United States, missing Americans. Please explain that.
Well, Danny, it's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, yeah, I forgot to welcome you. Hi. So let's understand why your studies are so shocking. Until now, I gather, people have compared America and Europe mainly in terms of the common measure that we call life expectancy, right? Which shows that on average, people in the U.S. die 4 years younger, which has never seemed to generate much public outrage.
The lay listener might think of that as 4 years late in life. What's the big deal, right?
Hey, I think it's a big deal. I'm late in life.
Well, many younger listeners might think about a few years late in life as not that big a difference.
But I take it that in recent years, researchers around the world have produced all kinds of health statistics in new ways that weren't available before. And you and your colleagues.
Yeah, we looked at the statistics in a slightly different way from how people had looked at it before.
And you found that if you look at everybody who dies in the United States, many of them would still be alive if the U.S. had the same death rates as Europe. And those are your missing Americans.
And there were 13 million of those missing Americans over the last 4 decades or so.
When I looked at that number, I thought I had it wrong. I thought, how could I not have learned this in all of my schooling? I mean, even in high school, I should have learned this. But I never learned this, that half of our under 65 mortality, almost half, is ostensibly avoidable. We calculated the number of deaths that would be averted in each year if the U.S. had the death rates of other wealthy nations, instead of what we have, which are death rates that are much higher. We found that in 2023, there were over 700,000 excess U.S. deaths relative to other wealthy nations. And this is a number that's increased starting in around 1980 and increased year on year. Since 1980, there have been over 13 million excess US deaths. These are deaths that wouldn't have occurred if the US had the lower mortality rates that we see in other countries.
Incredible. And it's especially tragic for Americans younger than 65 who died, because almost half of them would not have died if the U.S. had the same mortality rates as other advanced countries.
So let me add a list of those countries that you compared the U.S. to, at least in one of your studies. They were Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom.
Can we talk a little bit about COVID? Because one of the things that astonishes me about all this is that it's become fashionable almost for people to say, well, you know, the COVID epidemic was exaggerated and we overreacted. Your statistics, Jacob, show that during the COVID pandemic, the number of missing Americans who basically should have been alive but died, increased from over 500,000 to over 1 million. 1 million Americans died who didn't need to die if it weren't for all these factors. Unbelievable.
Absolutely.
And there was a greater toll among younger people also, right?
And a much greater toll amongst younger people. And so what's really interesting when you look at the pandemic mortality rates is that the U.S. did worse, but only slightly worse than other countries at older ages. Where the big difference happened was at younger ages, people in their 40s, 50s, early 60s, where there were huge differences in mortality rates in the U.S. versus other wealthy countries.
Now, Katherine, let me ask you, you have delved into the gaps between the rich and the poor, middle class and poor, so extensively in the U.S. What are the factors that contribute to this difference in mortality rates? All the wealthy countries that you compared the U.S. with have extensive government-funded health care. Is that right?
And one example is that people in the average European country have much easier access to health care when they need it than people in the United States on average. In a 2025 survey, 36% of U.S. adults reported that they skipped or delayed needed medical care because of cost, versus 3.6%, basically 1/10 as many of adults in Europe reported that they skipped going to the doctor or dealing with other medical needs.
You know, we do rely heavily on healthcare, but the question is why the patterns of illness to begin with? And those are much more closely tied to the investments we make in the social safety net more generally. You know, there were a series of classic studies done in England in the 1980s that are called the Whitehall studies. And they are called that because Whitehall is the center of government. But you had a national health service that meant you had more or less universal access to health care. Nonetheless, there are huge mortality differences and morbidity differences by income, by occupation, even in countries that had universally available healthcare. So, what explains that?
So within the countries, you're seeing great disparities by income, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Despite the fact that healthcare is basically universally available. Now, there are a whole bunch of issues that probably need to be taken into account, but it was nonetheless really quite an important study, those Whitehall studies, because it directed our attention to these aspects of inequality that are broader than healthcare. Healthcare matters a lot once you're sick, but the question of who gets sick is a different set of questions than what happens to you after you're sick. Let's just take the consequences of unemployment. If you are living in Sweden or in Denmark and you become unemployed, you are provided by the state and through a very generous tax-funded policy with income replacement that's vastly more generous than in the United States. You are provided with stable housing. So all of the things that fluctuate when you're unemployed in the United States don't fluctuate as much, especially in the social democracies. England is somewhere in between. It's a little bit more like the US in many ways. But these are not healthcare related expenditures. These are expenditures on social well-being more generally. And I think you can see this exploding in Congress right now. These questions about maintaining the Obamacare subsidies, very, very clearly an economic catastrophe for low-income and middle-income Americans.
Katherine Newman, one of the issues you've written about so powerfully is the cycle of despair that people plunge into if something goes wrong in their lives. How when people lose their jobs, how this touches off this massive deterioration of the whole family. They get depressed. They lose interest in their spouses and their children. The children are stressed, so they do worse. I mean,
it's a whole chain reaction.
And I'm looking at a chart now in contrast of what happens in some typical European countries when somebody loses their job compared to in the United States. And you mentioned this a bit earlier, some of these factors, you get much more of your former wages replaced in European countries for much longer than in the United States. Your unemployment benefits last much more. Your child benefits continue, although you start to lose them in the United States. You continue getting health insurance and access to good health care, which you lose in the United States. Anyway, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, we just don't have a commitment to stability. And I think that the experience of our European counterparts tells us that if you do underwrite that stability, you don't see people cycle down into a vortex of despair. You see them recover. They may well have a period in which they're struggling to find a new job, but they haven't lost everything else. Here, you lose everything. Interestingly, during the Biden administration, which, people seem to have forgotten some of the real virtuous aspects of the Biden administration, but when the COVID recession happened, it was very deep, it was very quick, and it rebounded almost immediately. There is no other economic recovery I'm familiar with where we had, absolute collapse of the economy and then it resurrected itself almost immediately. But one of the things that happened during that time, unusual for the United States, is that companies were encouraged and incentivized to keep people on the payroll, even when the jobs themselves disappeared. And what we know from a social policy like that is that if people are maintained in a job structure, even if their restaurants shut down, their ability to find a new job is much, much easier, much, much faster. So that was our brief experiment with a kind of investment in stability that I think really helped the United States recover really dramatically from one of the deepest and fastest recessions we've ever experienced. If you compare that to the post-2008 recession, it took us almost a decade to recover from it, and we lost a lot of people along the way. But that did not happen in the COVID recession because all of these social policies were dramatically different. And what that tells me is that in some occasions, in some periods, we see a kind of European-style consciousness develop in the United States. It doesn't last, right? We took 1/3 of the nation's poor children out of poverty. 1/3, almost overnight.
And let me add a couple of details.
In the summer of 2021, Congress voted to give most families a tax credit to help take care of their children. And millions of low-income families, more than 20 million low-income families, got between $4,000 and $5,000 each to help them get by. Those statistics are from a public interest group.
And then just to add the next chapter in the story, barely half a year later, Republicans in Congress killed the program and child poverty went way back up. Republicans said that they worried that low-income families were using that extra money to buy illegal drugs. Actually, studies show that low-income families used a lot of that extra money to pay for basic necessities like food and housing, which shows that when you give families more money, surprise, surprise, it makes a big difference.
It makes a huge difference, but we didn't stick with it, right? I mean, you go 2 years later and it's all disappeared. I think this draws our attention to things like investments in education, transportation, investments in housing and housing stability, our protection for people in a labor market that's volatile to provide them with greater security. These are the things that really stand out as very different in the United States compared to our more affluent counterparts.
Jacob?
In the United States, access to the factors that make people healthy are largely determined by income and wealth. It's what foods you can afford. It's where you can afford to live. Can you afford to live in a safe area next to a park? Does your neighborhood have sidewalks? All of these things are priced into housing prices, right? And so if you don't have the resources, you don't have access to a lot of the determinants of health, not just healthcare and medical care determinants of health, but a lot of the social and environmental determinants of health that are really the differences that are driving a lot of these mortality patterns. And in other countries, in a lot of other countries, based on better planning, more people have access. Access is more equitable to a lot of those social determinants.
And then you're talking about something called spatial segregation, which determines, as you say, where people can live. I guess a question would be then, can you draw very clear lines of causality between some of those factors of neighborhood and health and mortality?
Yeah, why would having sidewalks, I'm being a little simplistic here, why does having sidewalks and the other things you mentioned make you more healthy or less healthy?
Well, I'll tell you a story which was reported back in August in the New York Times. This is a really tragic story about a young kid who was walking down, this is North Carolina, was walking to the grocery store with his brother. They walk back together and are crossing the street and are hit by a speeding SUV.
Breaking update at a case involving a 7-year-old who was hit and killed by a car in Gastonia. That child's parents are now being held on a $1.5 million bond. Jessica Ivey and Samuel Jenkins appeared in court this afternoon, just 3 days after the death of their son, Legend. Now, the parents are charged with felony manslaughter, felony child neglect, and misdemeanor child neglect.
Now,
authorities say that
why did that happen? Well, there wasn't a crosswalk in either direction. So where were they supposed to cross? How could they go safely? This is clearly an environmentally determined tragedy, right? You had a large car, much larger than we'd see in other countries, with settlement patterns where we have strip malls and suburbs where you have to drive instead of walk. So it's not conducive to pedestrians. And all of these patterns determined this child's death. The coda to this story is that rather than blaming these structural factors and saying, how could we make things safer for pedestrians in this community, the local district attorney charged the parents with neglect and abuse of their child and threw them into jail. And so the way that in this country we think about tragedies like this, of poor health, where it's obvious that the determinants of this are social and physical and policy determinants, we privatize this loss. We say that this is that kid's fault. We say that this is that parent's fault. We absolve the system of responsibility. We absolve ourselves of responsibility, the policymakers of responsibility. And as a result, we keep seeing more and more and more of these early deaths in the country.
Just to remind everybody, we're talking with Jacob Bor, an epidemiologist at Boston University, and also with Katherine Newman. She's Executive Vice President of the University of California.
I'd like to focus on housing as one issue because it's an important one. And again, back to the spatial segregation idea, which creates a situation in which people have, in certain neighborhoods, lack of access to mobility via good schools, jobs that are geographically accessible. But housing is a major issue. Katherine, can you talk a bit about the relationship between housing and health?
Well, housing and transportation, I would say, are both very important factors. First of all, housing, of course, provides us with stable environments or not, as the case may be. Crowding makes a difference. If people are in crowded settings, there's communicable disease that can follow. I remember very vividly when I was working in Boston, and I was then the chancellor of the University of Massachusetts in Boston, when COVID descended. I realized that our students were living in multi-generational households, traveling on public transport, and that the likelihood of infection rates spreading was much greater for them than it was in more affluent communities, just because they were living in more crowded multi-generational households, and that I had to disband that campus as fast as possible in order to prevent the spread of COVID into these very vulnerable households. So housing controls our access to a stable environment. Unfortunately, for the way schools are organized, housing and school quality are very closely tied because of the finance structure that we have for schools that depend on local tax authority. So you have huge inequalities that are driven by this social policy. In other countries, these are national issues, not local issues. And anytime it's localized, you will see vast inequalities in the resources available to provide quality schools, avoidance of toxic exposures. I've spent a lot of time in poor rural communities, which are by far the most stressed, and things like mold, contamination of water, pipes that are rusted.
And mold can exacerbate asthma, which many children suffer from.
Asthma, toxic exposures, water quality all runs through the housing that is available to people. Way back in the 1940s, when public housing was first created in the United States, public housing then was regarded as kind of a, working and middle class amenity, and it descended into segregated housing for the poorest. And again, these resources that could have been equalizing ended up exactly the opposite. To go back to the example that Jacob was using before, if you don't have sidewalks, you don't walk as much. If you don't walk as much, your blood pressure is going to look worse, obesity is going to look worse. These are the proximate drivers of health inequalities, and they are very sensitive to the environmental setting that people are living in. If you're in a place with parks, or with trees, even with trees that will shade you in the summer, you will see that people get more exercise. If they get more exercise, they're going to be lower weight and healthier. So there's a long chain from the social determinants of health to the actual mortality data that's important to understand.
I did a story years ago in the 1990s about this really creative project in Boston, where the people at one of the big medical centers realized, wait a minute, the families that are coming in here sick or their children sick, when we really ask them, what's going on in your life, it turns out that they're in housing where their electricity was cut off, their heat was cut off in the middle of winter because they can't afford to pay the heating bill. And so this medical unit realized what we really need to do is hook up these families with lawyers who can call the landlords and say, wait a minute, turn that heat back on. And there were many examples.
And in the years following, the whole idea really blossomed. There are now 450 medical legal partnerships in 49 states and D.C. And they make a difference in health outcomes, according to the organization. There are fewer admissions to hospitals and fewer visits to the doctors and so forth. So lawyers can really make a difference in the health area.
And I think, just to piggyback on what Katherine's saying here, it's the residential segregation that exists, where people are being segregated based on their ability to pay for housing in different areas. And that's also, and historically in particular, racialized segregation with some very explicit racial exclusion, half a century ago. But even to this point today, where you have very segregated neighborhoods, that determines this whole suite of social determinants. Whether you have friends, whether you have community, whether people gather, whether the other people who are around exercising and going for runs. And so it's amazing how the sort of social context shapes our health behaviors. And Danny, you started talking about sort of, well, Americans do behave badly. Sometimes we don't exercise. Sometimes we eat unhealthy foods. Sometimes we drink. Sometimes we do drugs. We do those things in ways that are tremendously social patterned and socially determined. And we do drugs or we drink or we smoke because we face a tremendous amount of stress at work, or because that we don't have other coping mechanisms that are available, because we don't have enough time for leisure, because we're being targeted by cigarette and alcohol companies when we're young, when we're adolescents, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot about the environment in the US that leads to these adverse health outcomes indifferently depending on where you live and who you are.
And this is not true in wealthy countries? I mean, is there spatial segregation? Are there income disparities by neighborhood? Katherine, you mentioned the tax structure, which sounds different in the other wealthy countries. How do you compare the differences in all these other areas?
So if you take the Nordic countries, for example, Sweden, Denmark, the tax burden is vastly higher than in the US, vastly higher. But so is the provision of social services. So people are paying a lot more in taxes. But when you look at what they don't have to worry about, that we have to worry about all the time, it's an extraordinary difference in life quality. As I mentioned before, public transit. Public transit in Copenhagen is like nothing I have ever seen. The trains run every 90 seconds. You can get anywhere in that city at a very, very modest price. That is a socialized cost, meaning they pay through the tax structure for a transportation system that's available to everyone. Similarly with elder care. In Sweden, you can have a home health care worker who comes to visit an elderly person as many as 6 times a day, which is why they make so much less use of nursing homes compared to us. Again, this is afforded through a tax structure that is, certainly cuts into the income of the most affluent, but it is available in a much more universalistic fashion. Now, that said, I don't want to paint the European countries as absolute paragons of virtue here. I think if we look at the differences between immigrants and the native born, we will see gaps emerge in those countries. So it's not that they have absolutely no social divisions in those European countries, but if we take away the immigrant issue for the moment and just look at the native-born citizens of these countries, I would say that the tax burden that they face results in an extremely generous, not just social welfare policy, but an extremely generous investment in the well-being of the entire population. And that is why they are taller. That is why they're healthier. And in fact, all of the surveys we have show why they're happier. Because many of the stresses that we face, they don't. I mean, people do become unemployed in places like Sweden. It happens. But it's not a catastrophe. Here, it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe because you could be out of the labor force forever.
And you're losing your health care.
And because you will lose your income immediately and everything else that goes with it, your housing, your health care. That is not how these other countries have organized themselves, and it means it's a difference.
Well, I guess Trump hasn't read the memo because he's talking about Europe as, kind of collapsing in an uncivilizational way. And yet now we're hearing that a lot of things are better there. Have you looked at disparities between rural and urban areas? I've spent time up in Maine, rural Maine, and the healthcare there is pretty thin compared to the Washington, D.C. area where I live in the wintertime.
Having spent a lot of time, as you have, David, writing about poverty in the United States, I thought that urban poverty was, the biggest blight until I started spending time in rural poor regions. And I would vastly rather be in a city than out in the middle of nowhere. Just to give you an example of the kinds of health conditions I found in Alabama, I've been spending a lot of time doing research in Alabama. And the first book that I wrote on that topic was about the consequences of regressive taxation, which is the predominant financing of the public sector in the South.
Remind us all what regressive taxation means, please.
So sales tax. which everybody pays no matter what their income is a regressive tax. But income tax is not. So if you pay higher rates because you're more affluent, that's a progressive tax. But if you're paying the same no matter what your income level is, like sales tax or like fees, licensing, there are many kinds of taxes that are not adjusted by income. And that is especially true in the southern U.S.
And you're paying a higher percentage of your income.
You're paying a much higher percentage. My first trip to Alabama as a researcher was in connection with the attempt to try to repeal a food tax, which is 10% and higher.
Wow, really?
If 10% of your income is being chopped out by sales tax, all kinds of consequences follow.
This is at grocery stores, you mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Grocery stores, nothing is exempted from that sales tax. And so I went to try to help people campaign to repeal that tax, and that didn't work. It didn't fly. But let me tell you about some of the people that I met along the way who I profile in this book that was called Taxing the Poor. This was published quite a while ago. I'm thinking in particular of one woman I met who lived so far off the grid, I couldn't even find her on a GPS. She lived in a trailer, not a trailer park, a trailer that was on scrubland, 20 miles from the nearest store. Consequently, she went shopping once a month because she had no car. She would have to take precious dollars to pay someone to pick her up and take her shopping for food. And I arrived in her trailer on the day that she'd been shopping, and there were like shopping bags everywhere. But what kind of food do you buy if you can only go shopping once a month? You don't buy fresh fruit and vegetables. You buy canned goods. You buy stuff that's going to sit on the shelf for a long time. She was enormously obese. She was trying to help support her family by taking rip-off online for-profit courses, going deeply into debt to support them. The likelihood that that was ever going to result in a job that would help her pay her loans, much less earn an income otherwise, was slim. This is what you find in the outposts of very, very rural states. And that leads directly to health problems. I mean, I would be surprised, honestly, if that woman was still alive today, because she was just mad. She could barely move out of her chair. She was so overweight. And you would see this in rural Alabama. You would see people who were just heavily, heavily overweight, and mainly because they couldn't access decent food. You'd go into a store, if you could get to a store, and what would you see in that store? Again, you would see canned food that is preserved forever, but it's very high in salt, very high in fat, and that leads to high blood pressure, and it leads to early death. So I think our rural states are in many ways more stressed than our urban states, and partly because those rural states are also in deeply conservative parts of the country.
Speaking of which, let me add that in a city in Alabama some years ago, in Birmingham, the city council voted to increase the minimum wage around 40%. 2 days later, the conservative state legislature killed that increase in the minimum wage.
Does SNAP help folks like the woman you're talking about?
SNAP, of course, what used to be called food stamps.
So, these federal programs do make a difference. But again, when we look at how those federal programs are administered, many of them are locally administered, and they are highly inflected by local policy. So it does help, but our more conservative states often reject federal help. I mean, in the Great Depression, in the 1930s, when people were starving, typically the southern states refused to take the help that the federal government was offering. They didn't want to set up a welfare state, basically. So you had huge differences that attended these changes, even in the worst catastrophe the country has ever faced economically.
Well, there was a repeat of that after Obamacare, when conservative states rejected the expansion of Medicaid, even though the federal government was paying.
Right, was willing to pay.
Virtually all of it at first, yeah.
And one of the most interesting things about that is that you have in a number of states popular referenda that are then advancing the expansion of Medicaid in Republican states. So you have Republican electeds who are making policy against the health interests, but also really against the voting interests of some of their constituents, which is a very interesting pattern, just to recognize that these are not popular policies when you choose not to expand Medicaid.
Yeah, the question is, how do How do you get people to connect the dots between the way they vote and what happens to them in terms of policy? The Democrats have a big job to do in that regard, it seems to me.
I would say both the Democrats and the Republicans have a big job to do. We were talking about the causes of these excess deaths, and over half of the excess U.S. deaths are due to heart disease and diabetes. And so this goes to questions of food, it goes to questions of nutrition, it goes to questions of exercise, to environmental exposures, to things like pesticides. One of the things that has been very interesting to look at is the way that the MAHA agenda, RFK's Make America Healthy Again, has really recognized people's dissatisfaction around environmental determinants of chronic diseases, around the food environment, around environmental exposures. This is not an endorsement of MAHA or RFK's agenda, but the MAHA movement is picking up on that what we eat is making us sick, and it's because of what's available. It's because of what's available in school lunches. It's because of what's being put around us. And the reason that we're being fed such lousy food is because there are big companies that are making a lot of money off of it, who have weaseled their way into the policymaking process and have sort of corrupted our policymaking process and regulatory process. So I think what's interesting, I'm bringing this up because there's actually way broader consensus within the US about the importance of social determinants of health, even on the right. And you're seeing some people within Trump's constituency play to those issues. They're right that these are real issues. Now, once they get into power, they put the fox guarding the hen house in terms of, the EPA, or they're further entrenching the role of corporations within policymaking. And so they're not providing a solution. But just to say that a lot of people who've been voting Republican are those in the greatest need and are starting to connect some of these dots. Yes, it is about social determinants. Yes, it is about corporate capture.
So, Jacob, this observation leads me to ask Katherine, you've written that the more inequality, the more strongly people seem to endorse the notion that inequality is desirable and normative. Can you expand on that a bit? It's a pretty distressing notion.
Yes, I'm not sure that desirable is the right frame. Natural might be the more powerful frame, that it is the natural sort of state of nature, if you will, for countries and communities to be unequal. And you have yourself to blame if things don't work out the way you'd like them to. You weren't working hard enough. And that it reflects effort. This is such an old series of tropes, but it's still there. It reflects effort, it reflects virtue. So what I find most distressing about this is that it also becomes a way of explaining or believing that people have very different desires in life. And their effort is a reflection of those desires, right? Is it important for me to be educated? Well, if it is, then, I've put my effort toward being educated, and that has had consequences that are positive. And everyone had the chance to do that. And if they didn't, it's because they were too stupid or too lazy or too, just not motivated enough. So that just desserts is kind of a concept in social psychology that is, I think, a good explanation for why we normalize and accept these wide divergences that other countries don't. If instead we recognize that people begin with very unequal opportunity structures, but actually have very similar aspirations, I think we would get a lot further. And this has certainly been my observation in every poor community I've ever spent time in. The aspirations are much the same. They are not particularly radical. They're actually quite conservative. I want a white picket fence. I want a place to call my own. I want a degree of control over my life. I would like to have stable employment. I desire a job. I want to work. That desire to be part of the great American mainstream of the working world is very powerful, and people feel awful if they're excluded from it. And this is why I find the conservative perspective so disturbing and just not empirical. It's just not the case that people who are not working don't want to. It's usually because they haven't been given an opportunity, because they've been turned down, because the working conditions are so bad they can't keep them, because childcare is so inadequate that they can't stay in the workforce. The vast, vast majority of poor Americans work for a living. They earn too little to pull above the poverty line. The conditions of their jobs are quite unstable. Their earnings fluctuate, but they stick at it because they are as much creatures of this work ethic as the rest of us. So we have a pretty magical and I would say relatively uniform culture around these things, but what we don't have is a uniform opportunity structure, not even close.
You guys have been talking about how much more advanced, if that's the word, most European countries are compared to the United States in all these areas. But there's trouble brewing in Europe. I'm seeing reports coming out of august European institutions about the housing crisis developing. Rents are going way up. And even though they subsidize way more housing than the United States does, that's becoming a problem. People are complaining about much longer waits for health care than they used to. Part of this is associated with the huge influx of immigrants in recent years, but not all of it. So what's going to happen in Europe, guys?
Well, I think the first thing you need to understand is that Europe is not a single unified entity. Spain, Italy, Portugal look very different from Sweden, Denmark, Norway. These are different political systems. The sort of southern European countries have very weak welfare states, and they do not provide the kind of social care that we associate with the Nordic countries or even with Germany. So Europe is it's just like the United States has got these regional cultures that have political consequences. The same thing is definitely true in Europe. I've written a lot about this when I've been studying the period of time that young people spend in their families' homes, which has been growing and growing and growing in Spain and Italy and Portugal and in Japan. These are all weak welfare states. And so young people, and they're not so young anymore, they're like cresting into their 40s, are much more dependent on their parents and on co-housing and the family home because actually there's very weak welfare support. Totally different in Sweden. In Sweden, if you're 16 years old and you decide you want to study in a high school in a different city, the government will move you, give you a stipend, give you housing, and away you go. So Europe is not really a single category, and we need to kind of disaggregate in order to understand these differences. That's one point. The second is, sadly, for all of us, I think, the drift toward authoritarianism, the appeal of right-wing nationalism has been growing across Europe as well. And we'll have to see whether that's a sustained drift or whether it reflects the economic distress that followed from high inflation in the post-COVID period. But there are very worrying signs. I mean, the AfD in Germany, this is a Nazi party. Who would have thought that it would begin to capture as many electoral seats as it has? Italy is now in the hands of a right-wing government. Spain is the exception. Spain moved in a liberal direction, but we are seeing, authoritarians gain a grip in many parts of the world, and I think that is one of the greatest threats we face. And if they succeed, it will definitely put a brake on the kinds of equalizing policies we've been talking about here.
And Jacob, what about here in the United States? Speaking of the growing trend toward authoritarian regimes, what's the hope for people in the United States in terms of trying to, make the death rate lower? Are you and your colleagues studying, how is the death rate changing in the United States under this new politics? Or do we have to wait 5 or 10 years to find out?
Well, we're gonna have to wait at least a couple of years to see what's happened since Trump's second term. Certainly things don't look good in terms of what's being cut in terms of public health infrastructure, and a lot of the things that are being cut, divestment from public health research, are going to take decades to manifest. Cuts to Medicaid in terms of work requirements, cuts to SNAP, these things that are the key parts of Trump's taking primary determinants of health away from working class Americans and using that to pay for, in part, for tax cuts for the super wealthy. So we live in a paradoxical time where many of the people in this country that are voting for Trump are really negatively impacted by the policies that Trump is putting into place.
One of the things I worry about is whether we will be able to chart these impacts. Some of the most important research resources that we turn to understand long-term trends are at risk.
That's right, yeah.
And that has happened before. In the Reagan administration, we saw the suspension of various really critical resources that help us understand trends over time. And one of the first things that happens, one of the first casualties, is the ability to even say what has happened.
So in other words, government agencies are not collecting data the way they used to.
They're not collecting it, or they're not collecting it at the same pace that they did before, or the data quality goes down. Even the census becomes attacked as an instrument that they don't want to fund in exactly the same form. And this has an impact on whether or not we will be able to understand these trends over the long term.
Because they don't really want to display problems.
I don't think they want us to be able to measure this. I think that's a real issue. But as a social scientist and as a university leader, I worry about this because our ability to even understand what has happened to our society is at risk if those research resources go away. The question is, how quickly can we return ourselves to sanity, and how devastating will the changes be? Can we actually recover from them? And the jury's out on that, I think.
And even if the U.S. returns to what you call sanity, the death rate during the sanity period was still much higher than in many other countries.
That's true. Those are long-term structural questions, which I think this podcast has tried to point to and are important for people to understand. Typically, when people think about mortality, they think simply about health or health care. If we've learned nothing else, it's that health is very much a function of these socially determined experiences. And that, in turn, is a consequence of how we invest, or what we invest in and what we don't. Healthcare matters a lot once you're sick. But who gets sick and from what and at what frequency is a much broader question.
Katherine Newman, Jacob Bor, thank you guys so much. Katherine Newman is Executive Vice President of the University of California. Jacob Bor is Assistant Professor at Boston University. He's the lead author of the landmark study, Missing Americans, that came out a couple years ago. Thank you so much for joining us.
This was really depressing, but you're both terrific in describing the problem. Thanks.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for having us both.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.